Sysdig is the first cloud-native visibility and security platform that eliminates the need for standalone tools like container security and monitoring. Using Sysdig's unique data approach, enterprises can solve a variety of visibility and security issues at massive enterprise scale for multi- and hybrid cloud environments. Sysdig will enable your organization to scan and block vulnerable images and enforce best practices pre-production, block threats, enforce compliance, and monitor application performance, proactively alert on incidents, reduce MTTR with forensics, and capture detailed audit records, all from a single unified platform. Accelerate your transition to containers and then have confidence in your ongoing operations using Sysdig. To learn more, visit securityweekly.com/Sysdig.
Welcome back to Application Security Weekly. I'm your host, Mike Shima, joined by John Kinsella. Some of you told us that you are overwhelmed by the amount of content we distribute. In an attempt to make it a little easier for you to find what you're interested in, we've created our new listener interest list. Sign up for the list and select your interests by visiting securityweekly.com/subscribe and clicking the button to join the list. You can also now submit your suggestions for guests in our recently released guest suggestion form. Go to securityweekly.com/guests and enter your suggestions. Security Weekly will be at Hacker Halted in Atlanta, Georgia this October 10th and 11th. EC Council is offering our listeners a 15% discount to sit for any of their bootcamp courses or workshops. Visit securityweekly.com/hackerhalted to register now. Well, John, I don't know how closely you were paying attention to my intro before the interview segment, but to continue the theme, as the Crypt Keeper might say, we're going to bury you under a lot of news this week.
Yeah, we got quite a lot of stuff going on here.
We do.
It's getting hard for me to keep up myself, you know.
I think so. We're going to kick two quick ones out of the gate just around Cisco. One, because we continue to find directory traversal bugs or path traversal, so this is a fun one, in a Cisco Expressway. And one of the reasons, just kind of as an aside, it's become a bit of a running gag here now, but one of the reasons I like to call out these directory traversals is that you can have them in any of your quote-unquote memory-safe languages or any of your modern languages, because it really just means the developers have broken or created a broken down a barrier that should have been in place on the file system. So it just you're supposed to operate within uploading files to location X or reading files from location Y, but drop that // in there, and all of these modern languages, as well as the old school languages, support that ability to read from disk, and that's what happens when you don't pay attention. So that's my lecture of the day.
This was a fun one, just because, partially because it's in a VPN product. I mean, so they sort of weasel around the wording a little bit. If you look at their marketing, it's not officially a VPN, but it's designed to allow people to help you get over the firewall at your company. It's a VPN. Mm-hmm. So for a security product to have, and I'm going to jinx myself by saying this, but for a security product to have a directory traversal issue, this is where I was sort of hinting at in the previous segment, and as thinking about in the drive-in today. How do we, every time I was thinking through sort of like when I see, when my guys, I'm not watching every code commit right now, but when I was doing code reviews, one of the things I'd look for, like sort of common standard things, if I see someone taking input and then they go looking for a file, I'm going to go, okay, well, what are they doing? Is there any standardization? Are they checking? Are they actually using that input? So these things are on my mind. And I think they're on the mind of a lot of us in, as I said, InfoSec. So how do we get, and you can do application security training for your dev teams if you're a larger organization, run those classes. And that was always fun. But it's still, there's obviously, we're always in a rush. There's a lot of stuff going on. How do we make this easier for folks? And, just based off what you're around saying there, Mike, noodling in my head the last 30 seconds, maybe like a container with a Go binary. Okay, so you're going to really do a minimal, one example of a minimal footprint to try and minimize what could happen if there was a traversal. But I don't know. I think we're both going to keep finding these and throwing them into our list. But how can we do a little better here in communication to people?
Yeah, and I think unfortunately we didn't have you with us last week. And last week we talked a lot about LLVM and a lot of the default or a lot of the sanitizers that it has, like
Mm.
address sanitizers, thread, integer sanitizer, undefined behavior, because the compiler can do a lot of this help for you. But here we're talking about the, reading from the file system. We don't necessarily know, are we supposed to be reading from this area or not? So it does sound like there does need to be a lot more creativity, both on either continue to beat the drum of that, security education, developer education, as well as being more creative on what can be that default environment that just makes that less impactful or more difficult to exploit. Speaking of marketing, the other Cisco vuln here was a iOS XE vuln, and it is at least the first, at least off the top of my mind that I can think of, vuln naming that went for emojis rather than something other fancy. And the only thing I guess that I really was going to call this one out on is that I'm waiting for the InfoSec community to. We need a consequential vuln called Vulny McVulnface. And once that comes out, I'm willing to donate money to, some EFF or charity or something like that. But if we're going to go for emojis, let's just go all the way.
Yeah, this was a cute one. It's when I was looking at the link originally, you see like Trangry Cat. What's that? And it's obviously initially, okay, here we go, marketing vulnerabilities again. And then you look a little closer and actually see that they picked out the 3 emojis for it. I thought that was, kudos for however many beers they had in them when they came up with that one. But at the same time, this is sort of scary. It's of the pieces in my infrastructure where I don't want to see not just a vulnerability, but issues around secure boot. My networking gear is sort of pretty high up on that list. So I'm glad to see Cisco respond to this pretty quickly.
Yeah. So they definitely have to have a little bit of serious take on it as well to be able to pay attention to that. And on that theme of branded vulns, there was one that I think we probably should spend a little bit more time on, called Zombie Load. Now, obviously, this is just pandering to the audience for me because I'll react to anything with zombies in it. But this is another processor flaw. So it builds on the spirit of Meltdown Inspector, diving into the CPU to say, in this case, here is a side channel attack we can do with some what they're calling data sampling around. We have a particular processor. What else, what other thread, what other process is running on this same CPU? And what data can we get leaked out of it? What data can we infer from it? And in this case, what was interesting, they were highlighting that unlike Meltdown Inspector, you can't quite control the specific areas of memory or specific type of memory to go after. They call it this data sampling because you're just sort of watching to see what interesting things come by, so to speak. But that can still be pretty consequential if we talk about cloud environments, if we talk about processors with browsers, and browsers have all kinds of everything from URLs to cookies that are going to have interesting data to sample off of and steal, with this type of attack.
Yeah, I was one of the masses who over the years would always say, I don't care about side channel or sampling or a lot of these type of attacks because who's going to run them on my blah blah, either laptop or what have you. The browser sort of a good argument for that, but even better still is this whole cloud stuff. And now what it's got me wondering is, so I'm not sure exactly when they came out. AMD started doing servers for Amazon EC2 sometime in the past. It got on my radar at DockerCon a few weeks ago. But now I'm starting to wonder, hey, should I be, not just from a cost point of view, but sort of even from a, and this is a little bit of security through obscurity. Well, maybe not, but it's getting away from that Intel CPU that probably has a little bit too much baggage from about 30 years ago. Maybe that might be interesting to look at for some of these type of things, make the attacker's job a little more difficult. AMD came out this morning and saying that they are not vulnerable to these guys. I'm not sure if anyone's responded to that or yet not, but it's, it at least gives you a moment for pause on that.
Yeah, it was interesting because they did say, they did attempt, and they said that they were unable to reproduce the behavior on non-Intel Core and non-Xeon CPUs. One of the things too to kind of talk through that sort of threat model, because even when Rowhammer came out, I was also on the side of product security, application security, where I was still working to tamp down, can we please address this other cross-site scripting vuln? So there was a long list of other problems to run through before even considering something like Rowhammer. But even with like the cloud providers, there's a threat here. But one of the challenges I'd also throw out here is if you, not you, John, but if you as CISO are trying to think this through, would you be able to patch as quickly as one of these cloud providers would have? Do you have the resources to even know, have that asset inventory to know where you'd be vulnerable and then get things fixed? Or or what? In your grand scheme of threat models, what's keeping you up at night?
Yeah, the infrastructure to be able to recognize and handle. And one of the interesting things, most people who are doing virtual machines internally, at least, you've got VM migration turned on, and some of the cloud providers do. Amazon doesn't. I've always sort of wondered why. I'm sure they've got a good reason, but this is one of those cases where having the ability to migrate your VMs around is really wonderful. Migrate off, bounce your box, do whatever you need to do. Probably, I'm guessing, a firmware update, and then carry on about your day. So what's interesting to me. Mm-hmm. So I don't know if, just quickly on this one, I don't know how familiar you are with the Chinese CPUs. Remember, they stopped wanting to use the Intel stuff, which seeing what's happened over the last week or two is probably really in their best interest. But I wonder if they're sort of how vulnerable they are to this type of thing as well.
Yeah, that's interesting. We have quite the bifurcation now and geopolitical aspects pulling into InfoSec. And maybe I was going to broaden the conversation here a little bit too, to pull in two other articles that came up from Google. One about their 0 days and their data that they posted about in the wild exploitation, as well as SMS, or just the use of multifactor authentication and how effective that is. Because we sort of were talking about we used to didn't think maybe we didn't have to worry about Meltdown Inspector, but now maybe it is a little bit more consequential. But these were some interesting data that came out of Google as well, as we just talk about that idea of what should worry us the most, or how worried should we be. And one of the things from the Google in the wild data from Project Zero was that they commented across all vendors, it took about 15 days on average to patch a vulnerability. And in my mind, obviously these are actively exploited 0 days. So there is a sense of urgency, but I was, hopefully I'm not being cynical, but I was kind of impressed that number was so actually low as it is, even though 15 days, we could argue either way, is that low or high?
Yeah, so I've got mixed thoughts about, Project Zero in general and some stuff Google's doing in their announcements. But I thought this was really cool for them to come out with this. I'll start with that. I've started digging in on this data, and I think it's going to take a few more hours and then just constantly watching this over the years. It could be fun to watch the spreadsheet. But that 15 days sounded awfully low to me as well, right? And I think that's where part I want to do a little more digging around on that data. Are they? I don't doubt that they're looking pretty wide at what happened out there, but still, it'd be interesting to see where their sources are on that.
Yeah, I think because the other aspect is, if we go beyond just the 0 days are the worst thing ever, sort of, sky is falling claim. The Verizon DBIR came out, last week, and if you've got known vulnerabilities, those are the ones that are taking 30, 60, 90 days or even longer to patch. And those are the ones that are getting exploited, and they're going to be even easier to exploit. So, in the grand scheme of things, I'm not sure we have to worry about, 0 days being the always and only the worst thing that's going to happen to your environment, because it's great if you can patch anything within 15 days. But my other question then is, do you even know what all, basic asset inventory? Do you even know where all of your systems are? Do you even know what the patch manifest is on that currently, or even for that matter, what software is running on that? And those are the challenges to, really invest in, rather than to, put too much attention into 0 days always being the most worrisome thing that is going to come after your network.
Yeah, one of our guys Marco did a podcast last week. I mentioned it on my Twitter. But he was talking with an interview with somebody about the difference between vulnerability assessment versus vulnerability management, which the way he phrased it I thought was really interesting. And yeah, it's, even if you, on some of these systems, even if you know there's a vulnerability, you've got the patch, just scheduling that. If you can, if you have the faith that the patch, if the box will come back up after you patch it. So there's a lot of gotchas in that space that have to be thought about. And that's why I think that's one of the beauties of, if you can, where possible, move to some of these newer architectures like either cloud or containers or serverless. Since you're using something, it's probably not going to be quite as fragile. I'm not saying you're going to get rid of all the problems, but your ability to respond to them becomes a lot more operationally feasible.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, too, the other part of the Google security blog that I wanted to call attention to was they posted some cool data on just what they've seen with multi-factor authentication. So the two of us could sit here and we could say, SMS has SS7 problems and it could be hijacked, and we know the acronyms, we know that these attacks are possible, but from Google's perspective, they've seen just SMS being significantly effective against credential stuffing attacks. That was 100%. And then, I think it was over 90% effective on basic, bulk phishing scams. So these are basic countermeasures that are actually effective. And yeah, they're flawed. Just like we could say Intel Xeon, Intel Core, they've got now a zombie land type of vulnerability to deal with, but that's not the reason to simply throw them away and ignore them. It's just, let's iterate and reevaluate what our threat model looks like.
Yeah, it's that standard combination between risk mitigation, risk calculation, as well as security usability. So, if I need to get password recovery on my dog's collar or something like that, right, for all these IoT things, right, then sure, SMS is just fine. But at the same time, for what's going on my laptop, maybe something a little bit better.
Yeah, and that's where they're saying, having that, hardware token YubiKey style approach was 100% effective pretty much across the board. And so it's until there was a Bluetooth problem in it.
Sorry, that was too good for me not to foreshadow.
No, that was a great segue. That was good. So this was a small. So Bluetooth had a couple black eyes to mix the metaphors, I suppose, with these Titan security keys that Google provides. And I guess, what stood out to me here was there are problems that are in software. There are now problems in hardware, unsurprisingly, and that Google provided a very clear explanation of, am I affected? And here is how to mitigate in the short term, and we'll send you a replacement. So it's one of those things that is a very clear, a good response that goes beyond the cliche of, we take security seriously, or we take privacy seriously. So that's what stood out for me actually on this one.
Yeah, it's how do you respond to it? I don't think we had any known attacks in the wild around it, but once you, and it's tough to do, right? Especially this isn't just a software package. You're looking at a hardware recall. So props to them for hopping on it quickly and doing the right thing. That one always sort of, I don't know, I was never really confident. The idea of a 2FA token being Bluetooth was always sort of not really the best to me, but it seemed, that's just not from an actual pure technical reason, just from experience in Bluetooth. So it's hopefully it won't affect too many people.
Yeah, and it's a lot of, even just with on the hardware tokens too, we're sort of switching from the account takeover problem and becoming an account recovery problem, because all you have to do is drop, lose that key, and hopefully you have a backup key, or hopefully like you have a backup hardware token. But once you're locked out of your account, it's there's a lot of friction, as there probably should be, to get back into it. But it definitely is not a user-friendly experience to try, if you've lost a token.
No, especially at these large behemoths like Google. You just got me thinking there. I wonder, is there more money to be made on ransomware from on the account recovery side versus on the data recovery? That could be sort of, I don't want to give anybody ideas, but.
Yeah, that's interesting because, call back to the DBIR, that's where it was hacking and social attacks were the major threat vectors of, how did these incidents and breaches occurred. And they were clearly going for ransomware, or going where money is. So the point was account takeover on some account that has financial transactions or financial transaction capability. Because otherwise, what's, the quote unquote, what's in it for me, if you're just trying to hack for joy, there's a lot of go where the money is type of attitude. I did want to make sure we called out two interesting things rather than just talk about bugs. Microsoft had released a new version of their attack surface analyzer. And in the great modern Microsoft, it's on their GitHub repo. So this is an open source tool, and it basically allows you to say, get a baseline of your operating system, install an application, rerun this tool, and figure out what changed. And so, at a high level, you can kind of think of it as a sense of, did this application, did this widget that we just installed, is it following, least privilege type of capabilities or principles when you're installing it, or is there something that could be locked down from it?
Yeah, I didn't get to look at this one closely. It's I'm getting pretty close to. I go off to take a vacation here pretty soon just to catch up on some of these things I want to play with. It sounds great, and really, we've been tinkering with that idea around record, make a change, record, look at the difference again, and that's sort of. I think that's probably a little bit higher up that maturity model for a lot of folks from like a capability maturity model. But if you can do that type of thing and really sort of analyze your application from that point of view, I think you get a really great understanding of what's actually happening. So that's really cool.
Yeah, that's a good point, and especially when people are going into, everything must be containers. There's a big difference between we just migrated our, legacy system, dropped it in a container, versus we actually have a well-constrained container with setcomp BPF, and we're intercepting syscalls, and actually it can only write to this one temp directory, and it can write only, it can't even read from it. Those are definitely different levels of maturation in your development process to be able to go through those particular steps. Mm-hmm. One of the other things that would since wanted to try to also make sure we consider AppSec is not just about bugs, it's also about building software, designing software. And there was an article here on interface design talking about the who, what, where rule. And I thought this was a really nice, concise rule about thinking. It's almost a way of threat modeling, because it's the idea that every time a user takes an action, think about who, what, and where associated with that action. In other words, what was the identity that the user assumed when they're doing this? What action are they actually doing? Are they, trying to change their password? Are they just updating their status on Slack? Or are they, adding a new shipping address, something like that? And then where are the consequences of this action? Where are they happening, but where are the consequences of this action visible or relevant? And it's sort of like I saw John Wick 3 this weekend, and there was a very good theme of actions and consequences, let alone Keanu, having a great movie. But I thought this article about just building interface design and being clear about this who, what, where was pretty interesting and a nice thing to reference.
Yeah, so I think IAPP, where this paper came from, the International Association of Privacy Professionals, I think these guys are one of the sort of better kept secrets in InfoSec. they're a little, at first glance, they're a little more stuffy, a little more sort of, focused around continuing education credits and that sort of, legalistic certification processes. A lot of lawyers in there, but man, they've got a lot of really sharp folks doing a lot of really cool things. So this paper was a good reader, this blog post. Highly recommend folks go out and look at what they're doing in general, iapp.org.
Yeah, I agree, and that's a good call out to just the site in general, because one of the things is security is necessary for privacy, but it's not sufficient. There's a lot of encryption is needed, a lot of and we're talking about just two-factor authentication, SMS, and hardware tokens. But there's a lot of other aspects about when you start to pull on privacy on top of security that start to build in these engineering trade-offs, and we have to figure out what balances do we want to reach here.
Yeah, these guys. Well, I think a lot of people on the privacy side have been talking through, I don't want to say echo chamber, but really sort of talking about privacy for a while. And some of us get it, EFF, and a lot of us, and I mean, EFF is not just purely privacy, but a lot of us have cared about this for a long time. But I think as you're seeing us get more and more the rubber hitting the road with things like GDPR and things like that, it's the data privacy aspect is becoming more and more central of the data is the important part, not so much the application itself.
Yeah, and I think when you were rooting around earlier, trying to think of different attack scenarios or where the money is for ransomware, whether it's account takeover or account recovery, it's a lot of times too it's that data, and that's what the DBI Verizon's report was telling us as well.
Mm-hmm. And for just one last call out on that one, it's like, we've mentioned it a few times here, but if there's folks on the listeners that aren't familiar with that paper, yearly paper from Verizon is probably one of my favorite reads. It usually comes out a little bit closer to RSA, because this one only came out about a month ago this year, right? Or a few weeks ago. But, it's a free download. You might have to give away an email address or something, but every year it's nothing but a quality review of what those guys have been seeing over the last year.
Yeah, we had a chance to talk about it a little bit last week, and real quick, two of the things that stood out to me are the visual presentation. So the language in it is very concise, very clear, and the graphs are also, there's a lot of self-introspection on the graphs. They talk about why they're presenting data this way, and even they go into a little bit with their bar charts, why they include a little bit of the confidence interval in the bar charts as well. So that way we can talk about, rather than, say hacking, social attacks, these are high, but we're not throwing around very specifics of 62.7 attacks are like this, to some, significant digits that are a bit questionable. But there is some confidence that we know here is a range of how these incidents fell into, and this is where the data came from, and this is how to talk about it. And here is just why we're talking about threat actors, threat vectors. So I agree. Just echoing what you were, for our listeners to absolutely go out and read it. And I think they'll be lucky this year is that you can read it all online without having to give away your email address. So I don't think it's quite behind and not behind a paywall at all, but not even behind a register wall as well, which is nice.
Cool.
Going through my list, there was one other thing that I guess we do have to did want to highlight. There was a vulnerability in RDP, so Microsoft's remote desktop, and it was kind of a gnarly one because it's a pre-auth problem, meaning that it's essentially if you have access to the port, you possibly can exploit this. And it was bad enough that Microsoft uncharacteristically pulled out a patch for Windows XP. So, an operating system that should be dead and gone got a patch for this just because it was that bad, and they were, trying to get in front of another type, WannaCry type of outbreak throughout organizations.
Yeah, I think this is the first RDP we've seen in a while. They, back in the earlier days, RDP had a lot of issues. It was not quite the Flash poster child, but sort of in that direction. I think they got most of it sort of straightened away, but every now and then something will creep into these things, sort of like Windows XP.
Yeah, absolutely. So I think that's bringing us to an end. We've almost buried you under all this news. Anything else that you wanted to mention as you try to claw our way to the end here?
I think the one last thing for me is, I think you guys mentioned at the top, I'd love to get more feedback from our listeners. Reach out to us on Twitter, either at Security Weekly or myself, John L. Kinsella. Send us an email, reviews on iTunes or various different things. We're looking for what you guys what you want to hear about. What topics can we bring in, either, as we said, technical or maybe a little softer. We're all ears on what you guys are looking for.
Yeah, that's a great call. So please reach out to John, reach out to me. We'll post these on Twitter, on LinkedIn, whatever your preferred venue is for giving feedback. But that would be great to hear from you, from all of you listeners. And thank you, John, for a good week. This was a fun chat. And thanks everyone for joining us. We'll see you all next time on Application Security Weekly.